many. Did not do many means he did some. And did not means that it's not that he could not. Maybe he could not, but he did not probably for some other reason. Maybe he didn't want to. Perhaps he could, but he didn't want to. So Mark's gospel was very clear about this. He could not do many mighty works in his hometown. Partly because for Mark, the miracles that Jesus performs to a certain extent is related to the belief of the people. So if people believe, he will perform the miracles. And if they don't believe, he doesn't bother with them. He doesn't perform the miracles. And he now is amazed at their unbelief. So Mark has it in this way. One reading Mark will conclude that Jesus has some limitations. But one can see in which way that limitation is overcome in the other Gospels. Not overcome in fact, but overcome in the literature and the way that this is being depicted. So, in short, what has happened over time is that we can see in the Gospels that Jesus was a practitioner of the Jewish faith along with his Jewish contemporaries. He lived in a situation that was Jewish. His mother presented him to the temple. He was circumcised when he was 8 days old, according to the Jewish practices. And then his mother presented him to the temple when he was 40 days old, according to the prescriptions in the Torah of Moses. So they were following the prescriptions that are there. After Jesus, I mentioned the four Gospels. Following the four Gospels in the Christian New Testament is another book called the Acts of the Apostles. This is something like they have the Sahaba of Isa, the life of the Hawariyin. What happened to the disciples of Jesus after Jesus left the scene? Where they went, where they preached, what were they teaching? We can see in the Acts of the Apostles that the disciples of Jesus continued to worship in the Jewish synagogues, along with Jews. They continued to speak of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of our forefathers. So, worshiping along with Jews in the temple meant that they were praying to the same one God. So then, what was different? You have the Old Testament, which depicted the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as being one God. Now you have the disciples of Jesus after Jesus still doing the same thing. That's an indication that Jesus did not do anything different to change that proclamation. It was like that, it continued like that after Jesus. Jesus in between is part of the same continuing story. So that part of it is dependable. Jesus, obviously, according to academic biblical scholars, obviously maintained the same belief that there is only one God. So it is very clear that the idea that Jesus himself was God came to be developed after Jesus. And that development we can see occurring before our very eyes as we line up the four Gospels chronologically and see how Jesus is depicted from one Gospel to another. And we can see that Jesus literally grows. As a snowball, the more it's rolled around, the bigger it gets. As the stories about Jesus were being told from one person to another, being preached from one pulpit to another, from one minister to another, eventually the story itself grew. And like in the fish story where the fish gets bigger, here Jesus actually does become bigger the more the story is told. So if he does a small miracle in the Gospel according to Mark, he does a bigger one in the Gospels according to Matthew and Luke. And if he appears very human in the Gospel according to Mark, he appears to be very divine in the Gospel according to John, the last of the four to be written. So you can see a development of the way in which Jesus is being presented in the four Gospels over time, until it gets to the Council of Nicaea, long after the Gospels themselves are written, and then Jesus comes to be finally proclaimed as definitely very God. And that leads eventually to the full-blown doctrine of the Trinity. Where does Islam fit in there? We began actually with the Islamic concept of God, and we saw that the Islamic concept of God is similar to the concept of God in the Old Testament. And it's the proclamation that there is only one God. The Quran, which came to be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that we began to describe, as the Prophet was told, read, in the name of your Lord who creates. That is a call for people to come back to that conception of God which was already given to Abraham and to Moses and to Jesus. The God that was proclaimed by Abraham and Moses and Jesus, the one God, according to the Quran, is the only true God, and that is the God that we should return to. The Quran's message then is that we should believe in all of these prophets and messengers of God, in Abraham and Moses and Jesus. But we should not take any of them for God, not even Muhammad, to whom the last revelation came, especially not Muhammad, because Muhammad, on whom be peace, is depicted in the Quran definitely as a human being who should be followed as a prophet and messenger of God, as a model for humanity, but never to be revered as God. For Muslims then, there is only one God, and everyone else are his creatures, whether angels or human beings, big and great and powerful as they may be. As wondrous as the works of Jesus, nevertheless, these are works of a prophet, of a messenger of God, done not because Jesus himself is powerful, but because God is with him, and God is powerful. And this was the obvious proclamation of the earliest Christians, where, for example, in Acts of the Apostles in chapter 2, verse 22, Peter declares that Jesus was a man performing many mighty works among you by the power of God. So it's very clear that the earliest Christians understood Jesus to be a man, a human being, and they proclaimed him to be the Messiah. That is what actually the Quran itself proclaims Jesus to be, Al-Masih wa Isa ibn Maryam, the messenger, Jesus, son of Mary. Now, there are other things too that the Quran says in honor of Jesus. The Quran tells us that Jesus, in fact, was born by the special grace of God. And the story of the birth of Jesus in the Quran actually mirrors the story that is found in the Gospel according to Luke. In the Quran, the angel appears to Mary and says, I've come to give you the good news that you will have a son. And she says, how can I have a son when no mortal has touched me? And the angel then assures her that this is easy for God. God says, Huwa alayya hayyin, this is easy for me. And she's told, إِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونُ. When God decrees a thing, he only says to it be, and it becomes. So the thing can come into existence just on God's simple command. So what's difficult about God creating a human being like Jesus? So Jesus, for Muslims then, is a mighty messenger of God who performed many miraculous deeds. The Quran speaks about his miracles, his healing the blind and curing the leper and raising the dead back to life. The Quran speaks about some miracles that are not mentioned in the Christian Bible, showing the honesty with which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, proclaimed the revelation to us, just simply declaring what God has given him to declare, even though it seems to make someone else look greater than our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because the Prophet Muhammad did not do these things. And Jesus is reported to have done these things, and the Quran assures Muslim believers that this is how we should understand Jesus, as one who, by the grace of God and by his permission,